First of all, I'd like to welcome everyone and thank you for joining us today. My name is Brett Spear. I'm co-director of the University of Kentucky SURE Resource Center. And we're really excited today to provide this webinar because as many of you know, there have been some changes with the R16 program, but it looks like we're up and running again. So let me go ahead and share my screen. While I'm doing so, just to give you, for those who are not familiar with our webinars, just to mention a few things. Esther, did you have a?
Yeah, are you recording?
Yes, we are recording.
Okay. That was one of the
questions. Yeah, so a couple of things. First of all, we'll have some time at the end of today's webinar for Q&A, and we ask that you put your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll answer the questions as they come up. And also, we are recording today's webinar, so give us a couple of days, but we'll get, once we can get the recording set, we will put it on our YouTube channel so that you can go ahead and watch the recording at any further time. We do not provide the PowerPoint presentations, but again, you will have access to the recording afterwards. And once we get the recording set, we'll be sending an email out sharing the link for that recording as well. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Oh, let me run back here. I have it at the end here. Sorry about that. As I mentioned earlier, I'm co-director of the SURE Resource Center, and I'm joined today by Paul Murphy. Paul is the co-director as well. We're both faculty at the University of Kentucky. We both have had a lot of experience writing NIH grants and reviewing grants as well. So we're really happy to talk about the updates with the R16 program today. So just to give you a brief overview of what we hope to accomplish today. Talk just briefly about the contents of the R16 NOFOs. But really, it's really important that when you have the chance, if you haven't done so already, that you go ahead and read these NOFOs and read them carefully to make sure that as you're putting your R16 grants together, you have all the appropriate documents and all the appropriate information that is necessary for your grant to be reviewed. One of the main things we want to do today is to really talk about some of the changes between the previous NOFOs for both the SURE and SURE First grants, as well as what was published back in June. I'll touch upon some of the different documents that are required for the R16 applications. And really importantly, the last section, and Paul's going to cover this last section because he's already done some grant reviews, but he's going to talk a little bit about the new NIH review criteria. Because I think with the changes in the criteria, I think it really does change to some extent the way we're going to be preparing our grants, R16 grants and other grants as well. So with that in mind, I thought I'd just start with a timeline about what's been happening over the last year or so with the R16 program. So the previous Notice of Funding Opportunities, or NOFOs, for the SURE and SURE First were published over a year ago, March 14th, 2024. And then March of this year, on March 31st, these NOFOs were actually updated. That's a little bit unusual. Normally in a situation like this, they'll actually publish new NOFOs, but these were updated. And these changes were made in response to some of the new initiatives that happened with the change of the administration in Washington, D.C. And then on May 15th of this year, the NOFOs for both the SURE and SURE First were terminated. That did not mean that the program ended. It simply meant that they were not going to be accepting any new grant applications. And then less than a month later, on June 13th, the new NOFOs were published. And as I said, one of the goals this afternoon is to be able to compare the content in the new NOFOs with the previously published NOFOs. So this is just part of the NOFOs themselves. This is for the SURE First, but it's also the same for the SURE as well. So the next grant deadline for both SURE and SURE First is going to be September 29th of this year. And then we see the subsequent deadlines as well. So for the Sure and Sure First, there's always two deadlines every year, one at the end of September and a second one at the end of March. And the current NOFOs that were published last month are going to be active until September of 2028. A couple of things that just to touch upon to begin with, and you can take a look at this information in the NOFOs themselves, but one of the things that's a little bit different is they have a new component called funding opportunity goals. This was not in the previous NOFOs, but it specifically states that the goal of the NOFO was to ensure the vitality and continued production of the research enterprise, and that NIGMS is providing leadership in the supportive training of future scientists. And one of the important part of the components of the R16 grant is training for students. I think one of the things that's emphasized is that the SURE program was originally started by NIGMS, the National Institutes of General Medical Sciences. And even though many of the other institutes participate, NIGMS is still taking the lead role in this initiative. Criteria for faculty eligibility have not changed. Faculty must be full-time, either tenured or in a tenure track position, or if your institution does have the tenure system, whatever that equivalent is. So those that are in positions such as a postdoctoral fellowship, or maybe non-independent positions such as a research track faculty, which is not a tenured situation, those individuals are not eligible, so that has not changed. The budget and the project periods have not changed. And again, clinical trials are still not allowed. So these are some things that have not changed. Human subjects research is still allowed for R16 grants, but clinical trials still are not allowed. What are some of the things that have gone away? And I've listed the major ones here. So one is the Plan for Enhanced Diverse Perspectives, or the PEDP. This has been removed. The other thing is that originally with the student involvement plan, which is part of the research strategy, you were asked to discuss specifically how you were going to recruit underrepresented students into your research program. This is no longer required. In fact, it's not allowed. So you still have to talk about how you're going to recruit students into your research program, but you don't have to talk about underrepresented students. Now, in terms of your research strategy itself, regardless of the type of research that you're doing, you really don't want to mention terms such as ethnicity, race, or gender in your research design. So you have to make sure that you use other terms when you're describing your research. Socioeconomic status is still an acceptable term. Sex as a biological variable is also still very important. And so in your studies, especially if you're using animal models, it's important that you use males and females, whether it's mice or rats or other experimental organisms. And finally, this is just something from the additional review criteria. When it talked about human subjects research, you were supposed to talk about inclusion of women, minorities, and individuals across the lifespan in describing your human subjects work, and this has also been removed. So these are some of the things that are no longer required in the new NOFOs. And I should point out too, I'm really talking about some of the major changes between the new and the old NOFOs. If you sort of look through carefully with the old and the new, you'll see some differences in language and everything like that, but we're going to really focus on the major ones today. There's a lot of information here, but I just wanted to touch upon the program considerations with the old NOFOs, both for SURE and SURE First. Talked a little bit about the fact that your research has to be aligned with the mission of NIH, which is to improve the health of Americans. And then it went on to list all the different institutes that participated in the R16 program, and talked a little bit about each of the institutes. So this actually section goes on quite a bit. With the new NOFO, it simply talks about the fact that the research must fall within the scope of NIH, but it doesn't talk about all the individual programs. And you can look at section 4, which is down at the bottom of the NOFO, and that section will give you contact information for the different program officers for the different institutes and centers that participate in the R16 program. And I really encourage everyone, if you're thinking about an R16 grant, if you have an idea, I really encourage everyone to contact your program director Their information is their email addresses and phone numbers are listed at the bottom of the NOFOs, to talk to them about their research, to make sure that it's consistent with what they're interested in. And we really can't emphasize enough. And then the other thing that's part of this, the new considerations, it says, see Section 8, other information. This is at the bottom of the NOFO. And I really encourage everyone to look at that, because Section 8 gives you links for some of the different, some of the information that NIH publishes on a pretty regular basis, whether it's about their grants or contracts, any types of new notices or announcements on new funding opportunities. And things are changing really fast these days at NIH, so you really want to keep up on things. So I really encourage everyone to look at this information to keep abreast. There's been a little bit of a change in the application types that are allowed. So in the old versions for the SURE grants, you could submit a new grant. You could submit a renewal, so that after the funding period ends, you could try to renew that grant. But if you submitted a grant and it wasn't funded, you could resubmit that grant. So those were the three options. Now with the SURE First grants are not renewable. You can submit a new SURE First grant, or if you submitted a grant and it wasn't funded, you could resubmit that grant. Now, for SURE First, I said they're not renewable, but a SURE First at the end of the funding period can be transitioned into a SURE grant. Okay, so you could have long-term funding through the SURE First and SURE program. But one of the big changes with the new NOFOs is that you're now allowed to have what's called a revision for both the SURE and the SURE First. And just to remind everybody, I've listed some of the terms that we use when we talk about the different types of applications. So a new application is simply referring to an application that has not been previously proposed to NIH or has not received funding. And some of the terminology that NIH uses for this is a A0 application. If you submitted an application but it was not funded, you can modify your application following initial review and resubmit it for consideration. So that's considered a resubmission, or also called an A1 submission. A renewal is, again, after a funding period ends, you can request additional funding for a subsequent period of time. This is also, sometimes this is referred to a competing continuation. So for example, if you have a grant for 4 years and you're submitting a renewal, the next year that funding period would be called A5. Okay, so again, some of the different terms that are used. Now, a revision, which is something new, is this is where you can actually request for an increase in support for a current budget period to expand the scope of your project. So if you want to do additional work that requires additional money, you can request a revision. It's very similar to what's called a supplement. So a supplement is also another request for additional funds. The difference between these two is that a revision is a request for more money that actually goes out for review, whereas a supplement, if you request a supplement, that's administratively decided at NIH itself. So the program officer will make the decision of whether or not they'll grant that request. If you're ever thinking about a revision or a supplement, you should always contact your program officer ahead of time. So I think this is one of the bigger changes that we have with the R16 program. I know this is a busy slide here. What I have here is some differences in institutional eligibility. And for the most part, there is no change between the old and the new for both SURE and SURE First. For an institution to be eligible, it has to award an undergraduate degree or graduate degree in some type of biomedical or behavioral science. At the time of the application, the institution must not have received any more than $6 million in research project grants or RPGs in each of the 2 preceding years. And the NIH report is what is used to determine this. And then at least 25% of the undergraduate student population must be supported by Pell Grants in each of the 2 most recent years that data is available. Okay, so this is no different between the old eligibility and the new eligibility. But one difference is that in the old eligibility, if a institution was an HBCU or a tribal college or university, it automatically was eligible for the R16 program. And this has been eliminated in the new one. And so I really don't think this is going to affect a lot of institutions. I mean, if an HBCU or a TCU qualifies based on having a 4-year degree, less than $6 million in funding, and also has 25% of the students supported by Pell Grants, then those institutions will still be eligible for the R16 program. But there are some schools, one of the main issues is that a school must have IPEDS data in order to be eligible. So that means that there's an institution that does not have an undergraduate student population, and there are some medical colleges that have been that are historically founded to train Blacks in situations like that. So those institutions like Meharry Medical College is one that comes to mind, used to be eligible for the SURE program, but since there's no undergraduate students or any IPEDS data, that's no longer eligible. So that's one of the differences. And I just want to remind everybody, if you want to know if your institution is eligible, either through research project grants or IPEDS data, sometimes it's a little challenging to use these databases if you don't do it all the time. You're welcome to reach out to our resource center, ask us, and we will be happy to sort of look up to determine whether or not your institution is eligible. Little bit about funding restrictions. And again, this is another, I think, pretty significant change in the in the old and the new programs. So the thing I want to emphasize between the old SURE and the old SURE First is that the SURE awards could not be transferred from one institution to another. So that if a faculty member was awarded an R16 grant at their institution, if they moved to another institution, they had to give up their grant. Now, within the same institution, if the award had to be transferred to another a PI, that required approval, but that was a possibility, okay? So those were the old restrictions, but that's changed with the new restrictions. So it's a little bit more clear. They've outlined things a little bit greater, but one of the changes is that, again, a permanent change of a program director or a principal investigator is not allowed. So a temporary change might be allowed under particular circumstances, but not a permanent change. If the PI leaves the institution for whatever reason, a temporary change can be made, again, with prior approval from NIH, but in order for the grant to be sort of terminated in an orderly way. But the big difference now is that it does say that SURE awards, as well as SURE First awards, may be transferred from one SURE eligible institution to another with the consent of the recipient institution and getting prior approval from NIH. NIH does not expect this to happen very much, but they do specifically state here that the R16 grants can be transferred from one institution to another R16 eligible institution. So that's a pretty major change, I think, between the old and the new NOFOs. In terms of the other attachments, these are the 4 major attachments that are required for the R16 grants. Institutional letters, 2 letters are required. One is usually from someone at the level of the provost or the vice president for research, talking a little bit strategic planning for the building research capacity at the level of the institution. And then another letter is required from an institutional letter that's normally from the chair or the dean of the applicant's college, talking a little bit more specifically about the support that's going to be provided to the applicant. These 2 letters are required for both SURE and SURE First. The SURE First application, the PI also has to describe a research enhancement plan and also describe their prior, current, and pending support. And these letters were required in the original NOFOs, but one of the differences is that they specifically now state that when these attachments are uploaded to your final application here, they have specific names. So that's a little bit of difference here. So they have, NIH now wants these letters to be named very specifically when they're being uploaded into the final document. So something to keep in mind. And as I said, letters 1 and 2 are required for sure. 1 through 4 are required for sure first. Talk a little bit about the research strategy. Again, there's a little bit of difference in terms of the wording. They go into a little bit more detail about what is expected in the research strategy. And really for the old SURE grant, all it really says is that the student involvement plan, it talks about how you're going to be recruiting and training students when they come into your lab. That's really the only thing that was in the old SURE program. The SURE NOFO. For the SURE First, it goes into a little bit more detail. It does talk a little bit about how you're going to involve the students and recruit students into your research program here. But it talks a little bit about the experimental design as well. In fact, it specifically says that preliminary data are not required. Rather, the approach should be made compelling primarily by the logic of the arguments presented and referenced in the published literature. So preliminary data is not required for SURE First. In the new NOFOs, actually, for both the SURE as well as SURE First, it specifically states that preliminary data are not required for the application, but they may be included if available. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind when you're putting together your research strategy. Now, we always encourage people that it's really important to try to have preliminary data in your application, whether it's a SURE or a SURE First. Faculty or reviewers, when they're reading grants and reviewing grants, always like to see data. Data, if nothing else, demonstrates feasibility that if you're proposing to do certain types of experiments or using certain protocols, it demonstrates your ability to carry out those techniques. So I think preliminary data does have a lot of merit. But again, what it states here is that it's not required. So when reviewers are looking at grants, they cannot criticize a grant because of the absence of any types of preliminary data. So keep that in mind. Also keep in mind, if you are going to include data in your grant, make sure it's good data, because if you do include data, then it can be evaluated and judged. And if you have some data that's not really good, then that possibly could work against you. So again, a big change when you're putting together your research strategy or thinking about how you're going to be convincing reviewers that you're capable of carrying out the proposed studies. And finally, this is just at the end. This is talking a little bit about the criteria for both the new SURE and the new SURE First. And I just want to emphasize again, when it goes through this part of the NOFO, it states specifically that preliminary data are not required for both the SURE as well as the SURE First application. So reviewers are going to looking at different types of criteria, and that's something Paul's going to talk about in just a minute. But this issue about preliminary data is something that you should give careful consideration to as you're putting your grants together. I think that's pretty much where I wanted to sort of wrap up. So I'm going to turn it over to Paul. So Paul I'm going to stop my screen sharing.
Yeah.
And I'm going to let Paul, he should have, be able to share his.
You're going to have to let me screen share though.
Okay. You should have, you should be able to do it.
Here we go. I got it now. All right, are we on the right slide?
It's the right slide.
Okay, terrific. All right,
But the view isn't right, Paul. Can you switch it? We're seeing
let me
the
switch.
preview.
Whoops. Hold on, let me stop sharing, switch it over. Why things can't just be obvious all the time. How's that? Is that working now?
That looks good.
Okay, great. So I'm going to try to be brief on this so we have lots of time for questions. What's happened with the review criteria, and this has been something that's been in works for several years now. There were previously 5 separate categories. So this was significance, innovation, investigator, environment, and approach. And the thinking was that this was a bit too complicated and we didn't really need to have all of these separate scores because it wasn't clear how they were being weighted all the time and things like that. And there was a feeling that it was detracting or moving attention away from what really people wanted, which was a focus on whether this was a really interesting and impactful proposal. The other thing that was really, and I think this was actually more of a key driver, was that there's been an impression, which is quite fair, that there was an undue influence of reputational bias and institutional reputational bias, so both the investigator and the institution on the reviews. So there were well, not all the time, but often in reviews, it would come up where it would say something like, yeah, this is a decent enough proposal, but Bob is amazing. Bob is at this amazing Ivy League school, and I think he would do fine, even though there's lots of weaknesses. And there was a sense that that was unfair, that they were not being held to the same standard. So there's a real push in this new review criteria to diminish that reputational bias. And from my experience in one round of reviewing this, I think it's actually going to work quite well. All right, so what has changed? So what's happened is those previous 5 review criteria that I mentioned have now been reorganized into 3 factors. So the investigator and environment are now evaluated as either sufficient or with gaps identified into factor 3. And this is now considered in the overall impact score, but is not given its own separate score. And there are some additional criteria that are evaluated as part of factor 2, like your human subjects plan, vertebrate animals, but other things have been removed. So they now get evaluated by the administration at NIH and not by the reviewers. So this is things like select agent research, resource sharing, and things like that. So that removes some of the reviewer burden. There was also the sense that reviewers were not really doing a great job. They weren't aware of a lot of the regulations that surround these things. So it was better to not have them responsible. So the new 3 questions are kind of centered around 3 key parts of the review process that NIH wants to emphasize. So there's this first question, which is, should it be done? Which is the importance of the research itself. And this is where significance and innovation now are. Then the second one is, can it be done well? Which is the rigor and feasibility, or factor 2. And this is what used to be the approach section. And then the last one, factor 3, is, are the expertise and resources in place to do it? And that's your investigator and environment category. So only factors 1 and 2 actually receive an individual score from 1 to 9, same as before, 1 being the best, 9 being the weakest score. So the emphasis now is more clearly on this factor 1, which I think was never been true before, even though that was the intent. People often misinterpreted this. So this is combining significance and innovation. So the real important thing is significance here, which is evaluating the importance of the research in the context of current scientific challenges and opportunity, right? And assessing the rationale for the proposed study. So this is not just like, oh, I'm working on cancer and cancer is a big problem. No, it has to be a specific gap or a specific question that you're answering in that context. That's what significance is, and that's what you're focusing on. Now, the innovation within that is now assessing whether what you're doing applies novel concepts or approaches in ways that are going to enhance it, but it's no longer separated. So you're not going to get like bonus points for having a really clever method or something like that, unless the overall question you're studying is really interesting or important on its own, right? So it can enhance it a little bit, but it's not going to be an overall driving category anymore. It's now incorporated into this one, factor 1. And your second category or second factor is, can it be done well? So this is still the approach. You can still call it the approach. But what it's really doing here is evaluating how good your experimental design is, how rigorous your scientific approach is, how likely are your results going to be reproducible, given your attention to details of rigor and reproducibility itself, how well you're considering things like animal subjects and human subjects, and also the feasibility, things like, are these experiments possible within the time frame that you're doing, and that sort of stuff. So kind of the same stuff that's always been, but now I'm more focused on just the elements of rigor and feasibility. And then out the expertise and resources there, factor 3. The key difference here, so what we've done is they've taken the investigator score and the environmental score and squished it into this category where now it's just going to be appropriate or not. So when you go in to do the review for these things, basically, if you think that the resources are there in the environment, They have the adequate equipment available, adequate laboratory space and institutional support, and the investigator has enough expertise to do these studies with or without collaborators. You just click a box that says appropriate, and there is no comment box. So there is no means for you to comment as a reviewer whether this person is amazing or anything like that. So if you think there are issues, you click the box that says gaps identified or insufficient, and then you have to give a very specific thing. So for example, this proposal involves the use of turtles, and this investigator doesn't have any documented expertise with turtles, and they should actually seek a collaborator. I'm sure turtles are awesome. I don't know if that's something that NIH supports, but that's the idea. You're looking for a very specific deficiency. So you can't just say that I don't think this person has published enough. That's a separate thing that we'll come back to if we have time. I don't think it's important for this context. So as we do the actual reviews in study section, there's also, when people are presenting and talking about it, you're not allowed to have specific comments about the PI and institutional strength. So you can't say in your review that, oh, this person's great and they'll be able to overcome all this. You're no longer allowed to say that, right? So you can only raise weaknesses. So if you think about it on how that's going to impact your score, it can only bring it down. You can't get bonus points for being an amazing PI that's been doing this for 50 years. You can only have things reduced by missing things. And that actually seems to have worked pretty well in practice, at least through one round. Now for the R16, I would really super encourage all of you to read the actual review criteria as they apply to the R16 program, because one of the things that's kind of unique to this is the student involvement plan. And we get asked this all the time. And I just highlighted it in the different 3 review factors, 1, 2, and 3. And you notice that students come up in all 3 factors as being criteria for review. So that student involvement plan, even though it's only a third or a half a page maybe, is extremely important for driving your overall score because it figures into all 3 factors, right? So all that stuff about how your students are going to be involved in the research, how they're being trained, how they're being recruited, how they are actually reporting the research, are they having publications, are they going to conferences? All of that stuff is very important. And it's a very key score driver because it's going to show up in every one of those criteria. So you could be fine on factors 1 and 2 and get good scores, and you could get marked down on factor 3 by saying something, by not having enough information on, say, your ability to recruit and train students, your track record, so showing your qualifications of finding and recruiting students. If you didn't do a good job at that, that could be noted as a deficiency. So one of the things that comes up a lot in this about how scoring works, and I put together a little bit of a tutorial on this. It's very short so we can get to questions, is how you fit these things together. So you only have 2 scores. You have a score for factor 1 and a score for factor 2. And the scoring range is the same. So it's still that 1 to 9 range where 5 is meant to be a balance of strengths and weaknesses. So it's supposed to be in the middle. And that usually in practice is where the cutoff is for discussion. So a 5 is a good proposal, but not amazing, maybe has some weaknesses, could do a little better. When you go above that, so that high impact range 1, 2, and 3 is stuff that's what we think of in the fundable range. And then 7, 8, and 9, the lower end, is the stuff that is normally not discussed. So that overall impact score that you get is not the average of those 2 numbers that you have for factor 1 and factor 2. The best way to think about this is that factor 1, the significance and innovation, or that should it be done question, is your best possible score. If everything in your proposal worked out exactly as you planned it, this would be your maximum score you could get. So if that factor 1 score is a 3, that's the best score that you could get. And your overall impact score won't be higher than that, but it could be lower. So factor 2 is how good your proposal is going to be at addressing the questions you raise, that whole should it be done thing. So it's like, well, if they have these sort of experiments that they propose, how likely are they to get to that maximum score? So that can't be better than your factor 1 score for your overall impact, right? This is kind of your lower bound, right? So factor 1 you can think of as this is your maximum, and factor 2 is almost what could be thought of as your minimum. And factor 3 can't improve your overall score. That whole investigator and environment, it can just be weaknesses if you have deficiencies. And to try to hopefully make that clear, I've made a couple of examples for you. So here are a few examples. So your first one, here's your NIH scale from 1 to 9, with 1 being amazing and 9 being needs quite a bit of work. So let's say that your first score here for factor 1 is a 3, which is actually quite good. I mean, that's a very good significance innovation score. It means this is a very good research question and well worth doing. And let's say your factor 2 score is a 6. So this is your rigor and feasibility of your science, or can it be done well? So that's a little weaker, and the reviewers are going to focus on weaknesses in your study design and things like that. And let's say your factor 3 is flagged as adequate, so there's no comments on that at all. So it's just judged as fine. So your actual score is probably most likely going to be a 4 or a 5, because 3 is your maximum score and 6 is kind of your minimum. And depending on how the reviewers weight that factor 2 weakness, because they haven't identified any weaknesses in factor 3, that's how much your score is going to be pulled down for, right? So they've identified some weaknesses, so it can't be a 3. If they thought the weaknesses were sort of on the minor side, and there's a lot of wiggle room you can have as a reviewer for how you weight things as being minor versus moderate or major, they could give a 4 or 5, or they could think they could give it a 6, even if they think there are major weaknesses in the rigor and feasibility of the design of the experiments. But it's not going to be higher than a 3. So even if you resubmitted the grant and everything was fixed and everyone loved it, it still couldn't do better than 3, which could be enough to get it over the funding line. Now, the second example, I have kind of the opposite of that. So you have your factor 1 score as a 4, which is not bad. It's good, right? So it's above average. So this is a decent idea, right? And then your factor 2 score is a 2. So the reviewers thought, oh, the experiments and the study design is terrific. There's very few weaknesses, but these experiments are really well designed. And there are no comments or questions related to the environment. So the PI and the environment for the studies is fine. This one, the impact score is going to be a 4 because there are no weaknesses in factor 3 and factor 2, even though it's great, your final score cannot be better than your significant score in that factor 1. So this means the way to think about this is that if you have even the best possible experiments that you could do, if the question isn't really super interesting, it can't be any better than that, right? So even answering a question super well isn't really going to make that question more interesting than it already is. And the last one is how you might factor in that factor 3 component. So going back to the first example, we had factor 1 is 3, which is very good for that whole should it be done question. Factor 2 is a little weaker on the can it be done well. Now let's take a situation where you would have the factor 3 was inadequate. So weaknesses were identified or gaps in expertise identified for either the environment or the investigator. In this case, you're very likely to have an impact score of 6 because that factor 2 score is your kind of your lower bound. And really that factor 3 score can only pull your score down. And because it's been identified as having weaknesses, your score is not going to be better than a 6. Now, it could actually be worse because reviewers have a lot of leeway in how they're going to weight factors. If they think that the environment is extremely weak or the investigator is missing some really crucial aspects of expertise, then it could actually be lower, but it's most likely to come in at that lower bound of factor 2. Whew, I know that's a lot. Okay, so here's where I pause to tell all of you that we do have a grantsmanship bootcamp coming up next week. It's on Monday or Tuesday, July 21st and 22nd. That's the QR code up on the right side there if you want to catch that, or you can go to our website to register for it. What we're doing here is we've done this before and it's been very successful. On the first day, on the 21st, we have 3 sessions covering the different aspects of how you put together the R16 proposal on kind of the research, the really kind of the meat of the proposal, what you think of the actual grant application for it that's getting reviewed for the bulk of the emphasis, right? So you have how to write a really highly impactful specific aims page, how to hit your significance and innovation section really well, or how to really nail that factor 1 and how to really nail that factor 3 thing. So you're really covering that overall page of how you introduce your proposal to your study section and how you define your experiments in that 1-page summary of your whole proposal. And then those 2 key factors, factor 1 and factor 2, and how to answer those things best in your proposal. Then on the second day, we cover the other aspects of the grant proposal. So how you put together things like your select agents, your authentication plan, your resource sharing, and your data management plan, which still causes a lot of people great distress in how they put this together. Then how to put together a good, effective biosketch, and an environment and facilities section, so you can really make sure that you don't get any deficiencies flagged in factor 3. And then how that institutional letter of support gets put together. So what are the important things to make sure that you get into that institutional letter of support that goes with your R16 application, and what sort of pitfalls to avoid. And lastly, we're going to cover what to do for renewal, which is new to a lot of people since the program is not that old, and resubmissions, what to do when you're trying to answer questions that were raised in the first review and you want to go around for a second try. Brett, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that covers it well.
Okay, all right, so let's go. We have plenty of time for some questions here. So I will stop and end my screen share here, and then we can look at the questions in the Q&A box.
Yeah. I've got the questions up here, so I will go ahead and I'll read them as we go along. We'll get to as many of them as we can. The last slide, actually, it had the email address for our Sure Resource Center. It's simply sure.rc@uky.edu. If we don't get to your question or you have other questions, always feel to email us, and we will be able to answer your question, whether it's Paul or myself or members of our team who've joined us today. So reach out to us with any questions you might have. And as I said, we won't be providing the PowerPoint slides, but this presentation will be available on our YouTube channel in several days. So first question is asking about successful rates for different centers, like whether the grant is considered by NIDDK, NCI, to some of the different institutions. It's really hard to answer that question right now. In the previous to this summer, R16 grants were either reviewed by NIAID if they were immunology or infectious disease, but all the other grants were reviewed by NIGMS, and NIGMS made, in cooperation with other agencies, made funding decisions. So the agencies made the decisions. All R16 grants going forward are going to be reviewed by CSR, or the Center for Scientific Review. So we don't really know how the review process is going to play out. It looks like they're still going to have special emphasis panels reviewing R16 grants. It looks like they're going to have R16 grants are going to be clustered and reviewed with other R16 grants. So they're not going to be compared to other types of research grants, which is going to be good. But there's just a lot we don't know about this new review criteria and how that's going to impact funding or anything else. And again, we don't know anything about NIH budgets. So it's too early to talk about success rates for different centers at this time. Okay, second question has to do with some of the issues coming up with animal testing or animal models, giving NIH new efforts to focus on non-animals. Paul, do you have any comments about that?
Yeah, I'll comment on that from what I know and what I've heard. So for now, they've made some comments about how they were going to tackle this going forward, and how this has been phrased as deliver sort of two pieces of information. First of all, nothing is official until they actually post a notice explaining how they're going to interpret this guidance going forward. They're just kind of putting it out there that they're going to do something with it. So what the general guideline has been that they do not wish to fund purely animal-only studies. But the initial push on this has been very much on the drug discovery side. So this has been more on the stuff where if you want to do an investigational new drug application where previously you had to do animal testing for toxicology, they want that really de-emphasized. So they don't want that as being specifically funded anymore by NIH. It's not clear how that would impact basic science in terms of discovering new biology, if it will at all. But the way I've been talking to this with other folks is that even with the explanation of it being they were not going to fund purely animal research, that would mean that you'd still be able to have animal research projects funded as long as they have a non-animal component in there. So if you're doing in vitro work that goes along with it, so you can show that you're refining your animal studies by doing some in vitro stuff, so you're wasting fewer animals or using less animals, so refining a bit, and we think about 3 Rs, right? That would be fine. But again, we won't know for sure until they actually put out an actual notice. So it won't impact anything right now. It takes a while to put these things together and post them. And there's typically a comment period. So how long that will take is anybody's guess, but it would be a while yet. So it should not impact this round at all, depending on how quick they get it out, but it might in the future.
Great, thanks. There's a question about you know, being at, for example, if you're at a HBCU or a minority serving institution, how do you describe the merits of, you know, being at an institution like that when you're not really talking a lot about minority training? You know, I think in situations like that, you just have to really emphasize the success you've had with training students, and you know, perhaps some of the students that are at your institution might be have low socioeconomic. I think you just really have to emphasize that you're providing valuable training experiences to all students. And I think reviewers are going to see that. So again, it's not an ideal scenario, but I think we have to sort of live within the rules that are governing some of the, you know, what's going on these days. There are some questions about, you know, the issue, how the human subjects research has changed. I mean, certainly you still have to talk about safety issues, you know, how you can ensure safety for and justification for using that. I, you know, haven't looked into this enough myself to really be able to answer. And you're going to have to talk about, you know, numbers and all, but I haven't looked into this myself. I don't know if others on our panel looked into this at all.
I know we're going to talk about that a little bit on our boot camp next week.
Right.
How to deal with new requirements for things like inclusion. You no longer have that plan for inclusion for age and across the lifespan. That's no longer required.
Right.
But how you would tackle that specifically really is something that is going to be depending on the study you're doing, right? So, you know, that's something you need to get the basics of, and then maybe contact us and some other people that work on this more specifically. That's more specific to your field to see how they're tackling it.
Yeah. This is a question, but it's a comment. The comment is, I contacted the program officer, but had no response. And I do want to comment on that because that is, unfortunately, it's a very common occurrence these days. And we talk to a lot of people in our own experience ourselves in contacting program officers is either we're getting no response or the response I get is that we can't really tell you anything right now. I know it's unfortunate. A lot of us are dealing with it. I think people at NIH are somewhat overwhelmed with all the changes that are going on and trying to get, you know, information out, trying to review the grants. So, you know, this it's not uncommon. I think, you know, try to be patient. I think it's okay to, you know, if you don't get an answer, to try again, but I would not be too persistent because I think these people, a lot of the program people are overwhelmed. Question, so if a study exclusively African American, is that discouraged? You know, if you're studying if your study group is a particular group, I mean, I think, you know, you have to justify why that study is important. But again, I think it's just some certain types of words you really have to be careful you don't want to use. Paul or others, any experience with that?
Well, I mean, what you can do is you can take a look at what studies that NIH has canceled or curtailed, right? Because that's public. You can look those up and see what things have been a problem. And talking to your program officer when you get a hold of one is helpful. Because you can certainly, if you have a justification for a specific subject population because of a specific health aspect that impacts that population, you can justify that, right? I'm not quite sure how you can do much beyond that without getting into the specifics of what you're actually looking at. Right? They're looking for stuff that's generally impacting human health, health of Americans. And you can justify studies on specific populations, but you have to be really specific about what it is you're looking for and how it would then apply to just overall health of Americans.
Question about a resubmission. If I submitted a proposal before and it was not discussed, is that still considered a resubmission? The answer is yes. If a grant was submitted and it was reviewed, even if not discussed, if you put it in again, it's considered a resubmission. The other thing, someone asked a question about if a PI submitted a grant for the canceled May 25th deadline, would the same application to the September 2025 deadline also be considered a resubmission or new because of the new NOFO? Even though it's a new NOFO, it's still the funding opportunity. So even for September 25, it would still be considered a resubmission. Someone asked about examples for budgets. We don't have any specific examples. I will point out, though, that our resource center has a number of webinars that we've provided over the last 2.5 years. If you go to our website and look at our list of webinars, you'll see that we have many, many webinars on many, many different topics, including one webinar on putting your budget together. So I would suggest you look at that and take a look at that webinar. A lot of good information there. Paul, are you seeing anything?
So would it be viewed as a weakness not to train graduate students under these criteria? No, it would not. I mean, there's definitely a heavy focus on undergraduates for this. So, I mean, it's fine as long as if you're training undergraduates and that's your focus, that's totally fine.
Yes. Okay.
So it appears HBCUs are no longer eligible to apply for R16s. Is that correct? No, it depends on the basic criteria. So as long as your institution is below that $6 million per year in research project funding and has greater than 25% of Pell Grant eligible students, they're still eligible.
Someone asked a question about submitting a mirror grant as well as an R16 grant for different projects. That is allowable. You can do that. And they have to be on different projects. That's certainly for sure. You can only submit a single R16 grant. So you can't say submit 2 R16 grants on different projects. So only a single SURE or SURE First can come in from the same investigator, but you can have different grants. Now, if the mirror grant, for example, gets funded or has the opportunity to fund the mirror grant, that means that you will now have a grant and that you may not be able to get the R16 grant subsequent to the other grants. So that's something to think about, but I would worry about that down the road. But yes, you can submit an R16 as well as a different type of grant on different topics at the same time. References are not part of the 6-page research strategy. That's a separate document.
Yeah, invertebrate animals are a separate thing. You don't have to worry about anything if you're doing with, say, Drosophila or C. elegans or anything like that. That doesn't fall under vertebrate animals, so that's fine.
The question about non-tenure track faculty, whether they're eligible to apply, and the answer is no. Those faculty are not. Again, NIH, one of the goals of the R16 program is to support faculty who hopefully will be able to develop and maintain a research program for a reasonable period of time. So specifically faculty who are tenure or tenure track. Some institutions we work with don't have the tenure system, and in those situations, we're happy to talk to you to try help clarify eligibility or get you in touch with people at NIH that can clarify, that can
in those cases, they're looking for something at your institution that's tenure equivalent, how your institution defines it.
Right.
So that is doable, but you have to talk about that and make sure you're meeting that criteria.
Yep. Yep.
The new simplified review criteria for all applications. There are some differences for things like fellowships and training grants, because they have to have more of an emphasis on PI and environment. So they have to be weighted a bit differently. But yeah, everything is using the new simplified criteria now.
Does the R16 grant require an experimental research method? Okay. You should have an experimental design section of your grant, regardless of whether it's sort of behavioral science or basic biomedical molecular type of research. You sort of have to talk about your experimental design because that's going to be something that reviewers are going to evaluate.
But you may not be doing an experiment, if that's what you mean. It could be that you're doing exploratory data research, right? So you could be doing population-based stuff that's not an experiment. That's totally permissible. But you still have to have an experimental design section, even if you're not doing an experiment. So in that case, it would just be your research strategy, right? How are you going about collecting your data to ensure good rigor and reproducibility? How likely are you to get good results from this, right? Are you actually answering the question that you proposed in your significance and innovation section, right? So I mean, if the way you answer your question is to analyze publicly available population data on human health status and stuff like that, it's perfectly fine as long as you're using that to answer the question that you proposed for factor one.
Yeah.
Let's see. There's no problem with studying malaria. I mean, this is totally something that's within NIH domain, so that's fine. It doesn't, the actual free, this gets to the significance and innovation aspect of proposals. It doesn't matter the actual disease itself. All diseases are important. So it doesn't matter if it's a really rare disease or not, right? It's really, is the question you're answering going to have a significant impact, right? And that's it. So whether the disease is, I have colleagues that study diseases that, only a few hundred people in the world have, but they still get their stuff funded because they have some really interesting questions that relate to basic molecular biology and things like that. So you can do that.
Yeah. There's a question about PI effort. Is there a minimum expectation? The answer is yes. For the SureFirst applicants must devote 6 calendar months or 50% of their effort to the grant, which we understand is a lot. For the Sure grant, there's no minimum, but generally 10 to 20% or 1 to 2 calendar months is what's expected. Whatever's necessary to get the work done, really, for the Sure grant. And again, there's only some things we touched upon. There's a lot of other parts of the NOFOs that we simply didn't have time. We really focused on things that were different between the two. The mentor for a SureFirst is really going to be a combination of environment investigator. The mentor is going to be sort of part of that number 3 that Paul talked about.
Right. So if you're not a human subjects researcher by trade and you've only dabbled in it a bit, someone might raise in factor 3 that you should have a mentor that has expertise in putting together a human subject study because your expertise is weak on that. So that would be in factor 3.
Students can be supported by R16 grants to attend conferences like Abercams or SAPNAS, so that should not be a problem. NIH is still supporting these conferences. Now we're getting up to the 4 o'clock hour. Again, we appreciate all the questions. We appreciate your participation. I don't think we're going to be able to get to everything. Paul, are you willing to stay on for about 5 minutes or so?
Yeah, we can stay on a little bit longer. I understand people will have to leave, but we'll keep the recording going for a bit. If people have to go, they can catch up.
Yep. And so, yeah, you'll see that. And again, if we don't get to your question, feel free to email us and we'll answer your question then. What do you see next, Paul?
Let's see. There's some eligibility things which we can deal with separately. I don't think we want to necessarily talk about that. Let's see. Is it mandatory to pay students in Sure grants? It's not mandatory, but NIH does encourage it. We've had that question come up in the past. Again, Brett, you brought this up earlier on. If you apply for the application, can it be transferred? NIH now will consider that, but under rare circumstances. So it's no longer impossible, but it should be something to keep in mind that it might be challenging to get it. You have to have an agreement from both the institution it's originally awarded to and NIH. So, and then they have to think it's a good idea. So, and obviously you can't move it. If you went to a non-eligible institution, you wouldn't be able to move it. Let's see. We get this question a lot about collaborators. It is always really a good idea to have a collaborator to shore up a weakness. Just be careful about effort and subcontracts, because remember, the purpose of the Sure program, both Sure and SureFirst, is to build research capacity at your institution. So it kind of detracts from that if money is going to a different institution. So one way you could interpret that is saying it would be better if the money came to your institution. So if you had a collaborator at your institution, that would be maybe better. But that doesn't matter so much as, does the collaborator really bring something to the project that's helpful? You just don't want to have too much effort committed to collaborators, because the money's supposed to go to you and building your research program in the context of your institution.
we get a number of emails. The person is asking, my last submission impact score was a 51. I am eligible to apply for the September cycle. Should I do a resubmission? I will say that even people, I mean, 51 is not necessarily a score that I would say is a slam dunk for funding. I just don't know for sure, but it's not an outstanding score. It's just a solid score. But we know people that even have had really, really good scores where everything looks like they're going to get funded and they're not getting their notice of award. So things are really slow at NIH in terms of getting the notice of awards out, even with good scores. So we're urging people just to be patient. I would suggest seeing if you can contact your program officer to get some feedback about questions like this. But I guess my thought is if with a score like 51, you might want to consider resubmitting. But it's a tough call.
Yeah, that's usually what, that's what we consider a good score, right? So, I mean, that's kind of like might be funded if they were enthusiastic about the project itself and they have enough money left at the end of the year. So I would definitely, if you have a score like that, it's kind of on the bubble, your program officer will almost always recommend that you resubmit it. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Our grantsmanship boot camps will be recorded and put on our YouTube channel. It's not clear how many students you really want to. I mean, you don't have to have a lot of students to be involved. I think getting a couple of students, 2 or 3 students, undergrad students involved with the research project, I think is a good number. I don't. And one could argue if you have a ton of students, then they're not going to really get good training. So I think, I think it doesn't have to be a large number, but whatever number that you have and whatever is reasonable, you have to make sure that they're really getting a good experience. They're doing something meaningful. Hopefully they're going to be on abstract so that they might be able to attend a meeting or even get a publication. So I think the quality of what they're getting is going to be, more important than just the numbers, but make whatever is reasonable. I think you should consider that as well.
But can I also add here, because I've seen some other questions coming up in the chat too about students. And when we talk about students, undergraduates or graduate students count, and high school students count as well. So whatever population you have access to, especially if you maybe have some relationships, all of those students count as student involvement. I'm not sure that postdocs necessarily would, but I think, I don't know about that, but certainly when we talk students, that's high school, undergrad, and grad, whatever you have access to.
Yeah, but probably undergrads are probably considered a little more than the other categories. You're right, though. Yeah, but real quick, before someone asked about Friday office hours. Our resource center does offer Friday office hours between 3 and 4 Eastern time every Friday afternoon. If you go to our website, you'll see the link to the office hours. You don't have to sign up or anything like that. Paul, myself, and or Kat, our administrative assistant, we will be at office hours. So if you have any questions, you want to talk a little bit more in depth about things, you're welcome just to sign in. I guess you don't have to sign in. You just sort of have to join us and we'll be happy to talk with you. So Friday office hours are still happening. Someone asked about it being explicit about being at a resource limited institution. I wouldn't talk too much about being resource limited. I think what you want to try to do is to emphasize the resources that you do have and try to build a case that you are capable of carrying out whatever you propose doing.
I agree with that. I mean, you're already eligible for the program by submitting, so you don't need to talk about that. You want to show that you're capable of doing what you're proposing.
Yeah.
There are a couple of like minor technical things about the length of the proposal is not changed. It's still 6 pages, 1 page for specific games. Yes, the student involvement plan in the R15 and R16 is very similar. You have more space in the R15 to write about than you do in the R16, but they're very similar and they're evaluated very similar ways. You can't have multi-PIs on R16s, right?
That's correct. Yep.
Um,
Now, a question about the person has an NSF grant. Are they still eligible for R16 grants? The answer is yes, you are eligible for the SURE grant. Not for SURE First because you have a grant, but it's not NIH. So if you have an NSF grant or a grant from another institution, you can still submit a SURE grant. If you have an NIH research grant, then you're not eligible. The other thing is that sometimes people may have a grant as a subaward of another grant. So let's say your institution has a grant and you've been given a subaward off of that grant. Are you still eligible? And the answer is yes, because you're not the PI of the original grant. So in those situations, you would still be eligible to submit a SURE First if you can never had a grant, or you could submit a SURE grant as well. So.
Let me comment on, I've seen several iterations of this question again about animal and sex differences and stuff like that. So for gender gaps in humans and sex differences, this is still a legit topic of study. There's not like, oh, you can't study that anymore. If there's a good reason for it, you can. I mean, because otherwise you would have things like you can't study things like breast cancer anymore, or you can't study prostate cancer because they're sex-specific things. There are ways, as long as what you're doing is impactful, that is still fine. For stuff for animal models, you just have to be, what they're trying to de-emphasize, at least from the early interpretation of this, is sort of like what you would think of as mechanical sort of studies to get towards regulatory approval of things, right? So basic biology is still fine. They just want to make sure that you are doing good refinement on your studies. So some say computational models, in vitro studies, things like that, that would kind of refine your animal stuff a bit more. It's not going to be excluded. They're trying to get away from things that are just like doing, I'm going to do an LD50 test in this to make sure that this drug is safe to go to humans. They want that stuff to be really de-emphasized. It doesn't mean that you can't do it. It just means that it's going to be given a lower priority at the funding level, not at the review level, because this has come up in questions a couple of times. Reviewers can still review it whatever way they want, and they can say they think this is worth doing or not. This is more like a programmatic decision. So they're going to de-emphasize things that look like they're not really contributing any more to human knowledge. Because the argument for this is that with the animal studies in particular, it said, well, a lot of these things don't, this toxicology screening for new drug approvals doesn't really predict efficacy and is not really all that impactful, right? We can have a long, lengthy discussion with me as an IACUC chair about whether that is the right way to go about this or not. But I mean, that's how they're doing it now. But we'll have to wait until the formal guidance comes out for that. But definitely don't shy away from things like working on specific subject populations or sex differences, especially at the human level, because this is really important. Especially in my field, I study Alzheimer's disease. And one of the things we're very interested in is relative vulnerability of women versus men. And women are much more vulnerable to AD. And there are very interesting reasons for that. And it's really, really important. So that sort of research is all fine.
I'll answer one more and then Paul can answer one. About trainees. Can postdocs be supported? The answer is yes, but postdocs are pretty expensive, and the maximum grant for a SURE First is 100 or 125,000, and a postdoc could take up a lot of that money. So I'm not sure that's wise use of funds because it's going to really limit other things. So I think you should try to prioritize students, whether it's graduate students or undergraduates. And the other thing too is that students can be paid off of the SURE grant. So that is an allowable expense.
Yeah, there's a lot of really interesting specific questions that I would love to answer. We're not going to have time. You can feel free to email us and get back to you because some of these are really, they're really interesting little things that are specific to interesting individual research projects. And that we can answer those if you send us emails directly. I'm more looking for things that are going to be general interest here.
I would also say that a number of the questions that I'm seeing are things that have been addressed in previous webinars. So you could go find that that information on the YouTube site, but are probably also going to be the subject of upcoming webinars over the next year. So they're much too complicated to answer in a 2-minute answer here.
Yeah, thanks, Martha. So listen, we really appreciate your attention and joining us today. We're excited that a lot of you are still interested in the R16 program. It's been a little bit of a roller coaster ride, but we're still excited about the program. Our resource center is funded by a U24 grant from NIH. Our goal is to help you in any way that we can. So reach out to us. As Paul mentioned too, email us with questions. We'll answer your questions. Join us for our Friday office hours, and we'll do the best we can to help you. And with that, thanks again. And
I would encourage y'all especially for a lot of the more specific questions on things like how to divide different sections, where to put things. We're doing that next week at our 2-day training boot camp. So I would encourage y'all to register for that and attend.
Great. All right. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate your attention.